On July 31st, 2026, a user posting under the handle, Zilly sat down and did something that would reach more than 110,000 people within 48 hours. They had spotted a background service quietly running on Windows 11, called it out in a post, written partly in all capital letters, and claimed Microsoft had secretly added something to every PC that monitors CPU load, thermals, and battery status, then phones that information home to Microsoft every 15 minutes. The post spread fast enough and struck a raw enough nerve that a Microsoft vice president had to personally step in and publicly explain, line by line, what a piece of background code on your own computer actually does. Think about that for a second. A senior executive at one of the largest technology companies on the planet had to interrupt his week to debug a stranger's tweet about his own operating system. That alone tells you something important about where trust between Microsoft and its users currently stands. The service at the center of the panic is called Windows Health and Optimized Experiences, internally labeled WHSVC, and it starts automatically every time a Windows 11 machine boots up. Scott Hanselman, Microsoft's vice president and a well-known member of its technical staff, responded directly, stating plainly that the data captured by this specific service stays local on the machine, and that nothing leaves the computer unless the user personally chooses to submit a report through the feedback hub. He closed his response with a line that ended up generating its own headlines, noting that writing something in all capital letters for dramatic effect doesn't actually make it dramatic. And on the narrow question he was actually asked about, he was correct. But here's what almost nobody discussing this story stopped to mention. There is a second background service running on Windows machines right now that genuinely does contact Microsoft on a recurring timer and has been doing so for years. It isn't secret exactly, but Microsoft has also never gone out of its way to explain it in plain language either. It's called DiagTrack, and if you've never heard that name before, that gap in awareness is precisely the problem worth examining. To understand what actually happened last week, you need the full picture of both services, because one of them is the story Microsoft wanted the internet talking about, and the other is the one that actually deserved the attention. Windows Health and Optimized Experiences, the service Zilly originally flagged, has technically been present inside Windows 11 since 2025, first documented by a developer named Albacore. When it appeared inside an early Canary test build, Microsoft distributes ahead of wider public releases. The underlying code runs a script that samples CPU load, thermal readings, screen brightness, and battery percentage on the device. Buried inside the service's configuration is an environment variable governing telemetry frequency, set to a 15-minute interval, and that specific number is exactly where the viral claims headline figure originated. What the viral post got wrong was what those 15-minute samples actually do with the data they collect. When Windows detects that a machine is running unusually slowly, the service captures a local performance trace and saves it directly to a folder on the user's own hard drive. Specifically, a path under the system's temp directory that most people will never manually navigate to. That trace simply sits there on the local disk until the user personally opens the Feedback Hub application, selects the specific category for desktop and system sluggishness, and actively chooses to submit a report. Only at that exact point does any of that data leave the machine and reach Microsoft at all. Hanselman confirmed this directly, and multiple independent technical outlets, including Windows Latest and NeoWin, verified that the actual code matches this description. It's also worth noting, since it adds useful context to why the panic spread so effectively, that the original account behind the viral post reportedly sells a paid PC performance tuning service marketed to gamers, a detail several outlets covering the story flagged as relevant to understanding the incentive behind framing a routine diagnostic tool as an active surveillance threat. So the specific 15-minute outbound monitoring claim attached to this particular service was inaccurate. But here's what's genuinely worth sitting with before this story wraps up as a simple correction. The reason an inaccurate claim about a relatively benign diagnostic service spread to more than 110,000 people within days isn't because the internet is broadly gullible. It's because Microsoft has spent the last 2 years making distrust the entirely rational default position for its own users. In May of 2024, Microsoft announced a feature for its new Copilot Plus PCs called Recall. The pitch was straightforward on its surface: an AI assistant that takes a screenshot of everything displayed on your screen every few seconds, indexes all of that content, and lets you later search your own history using plain, natural language, asking it to pull up a recipe you looked at 2 weeks earlier, and having it locate that exact moment. Privacy researchers offered a very different framing almost immediately. One security expert publicly asked why anyone would bother installing separate keylogging software when Microsoft was now building an equivalent capability directly into the operating system itself. The United Kingdom's Information Commissioner's Office, the government body responsible for enforcing the country's data protection law, formally wrote to Microsoft demanding an explanation of what safeguards actually existed around the feature. The encrypted messaging app, Signal, an application millions of people rely on specifically because its contents are designed to be uninterceptable, built a dedicated countermeasure directly into its own software, specifically to prevent recall from being able to capture screenshots of its windows at all. Microsoft delayed the feature twice, substantially overhauled its underlying architecture in direct response to the criticism, made it opt-in rather than default on, and eventually shipped the reworked version in early 2025. Security researchers, who later tested that revised version, generally acknowledged Microsoft had made serious, credible efforts to address the earlier vulnerabilities, but they also noted the fundamental architecture remains genuinely difficult to fully secure on any machine shared by multiple users. Recall is, in a very real sense, the reason 110,000 people were willing to believe a background service was actively spying on them within 48 hours of a single viral post. Microsoft built that underlying distrust itself, one product decision at a time. Now consider the other service, the one that actually deserves scrutiny. DiagTrack carries the longer official name, Connected User Experiences and Telemetry, and that's precisely how it appears listed inside the Windows Services panel if you go looking for it. It has been part of Windows since the Windows 10 era and carries forward unchanged into Windows 11. Unlike the diagnostic tool at the center of last week's panic, DiagTrack is not primarily a local-only diagnostic capture tool. It functions as an actual telemetry pipeline, transmitting data outward on a schedule. Technology journalist Ed Bott has run detailed, hands-on technical investigations into DiagTrack's behavior across multiple, separate testing periods over the years, monitoring the service's activity directly using Windows Task Manager and the built-in Resource Monitor tool. What his testing found matched Microsoft's own published documentation closely. DiagTrack performs an initial performance measurement when a machine starts up, then checks the contents of 4 specific log files roughly every 15 minutes. On a machine running on wall power with a wired network connection, that behavior adds up to somewhere around 30 to 33 separate outbound connections, roughly every 8 hours. Each individual transmission is genuinely small, with Microsoft's own published figures putting the average size at around 1.2 kilobytes per transmission, a figure independent testing has consistently confirmed. On a metered network connection, or a laptop running on battery power, that frequency drops substantially, checking in roughly once every 4 hours on battery, and according to Microsoft's stated policy, not transmitting data at all over a connection explicitly marked as metered. What specific content gets transmitted depends entirely on which telemetry level a given machine is configured. Windows 11 distinguishes between what Microsoft calls required diagnostic data and optional diagnostic data. The required tier covers crash reports, error information, and basic system health signals needed to keep the platform functioning reliably. The optional tier adds considerably richer usage information layered on top. Critically, on Windows Home Edition specifically, there is no official setting that lets a user reduce telemetry all the way down to 0. The lowest available setting through official channels only drops collection down to that required baseline, not below it. The DiagTrack service itself isn't exactly hidden in some deliberately obscured way. Typing services.msc into the Windows Run dialog brings it up by its actual name without any special effort. But Microsoft has also never made a serious, sustained effort to clearly explain to ordinary users what it collects or how to meaningfully control it, and users in Microsoft's own support forums have repeatedly reported that DiagTrack quietly re-enables itself after major feature updates, even on machines where the setting had been deliberately changed beforehand. Microsoft does provide an opt-out mechanism inside settings, under privacy and security, then diagnostics and feedback, but that setting defaults toward collecting the optional tier of data, and major Windows updates have a well-documented history of resetting that preference back to its default state without clear warning. This is precisely the part of the story that Hanselman's public response never addressed, largely because nobody had actually asked him about it directly. The WSVC service generated 110,000 alarmed posts because it carried an unfamiliar name, a genuinely suspicious-sounding description, and a 15-minute variable visible right there in its code. It turned out, once independently verified, to be relatively benign in practice. DiagTrack, by contrast, carries a familiar name, is documented across multiple official Microsoft sources, has an independently verified 15-minute check-in cycle that does result in actual outbound data transmission, and has been running quietly on Windows machines for the better part of a decade, without most users having any detailed awareness of what it's doing. The real question here was never simply whether DiagTrack is technically disclosed somewhere in official documentation. It obviously is. The real question is whether Microsoft has ever made a genuine, clear, plain language effort to communicate that disclosure to the people actually affected by it. The fact that a corporate vice president had to personally step in and debug a stranger's viral tweet just to explain why one largely harmless service was safe suggests the honest answer to that broader question is no. If you're the kind of person already inclined to distrust Windows' default settings, this pattern likely doesn't surprise you much. But for anyone who has never actually opened the Services panel on their own machine before, here's exactly what you can do right now, using only Windows' own built-in tools, no third-party software required. Press the Windows key and R together to open the Run dialog. Type services.msc and press Enter. Scroll down until you find the entry labeled Connected User Experiences and Telemetry, which is diagtrack under its official display name. Right-click it, select Properties, click Stop to immediately halt the currently running service, and then set its startup type to disabled so it doesn't automatically restart the next time the machine boots. Click Apply, then OK. If you'd also like to disable Windows Health and Optimized Experiences, even though what it collects stays local by default, you can find it in that same services list and disable it using the identical steps. For anyone wanting a deeper, more update-resistant level of control, opening the registry editor by pressing Windows key and R, typing regedit, and navigating through HKEI local machine, then software, then policies, then Microsoft, then Windows, then data collection, lets you create or modify a DWORD value named allow telemetry and set it to 0. This enforces the restriction at the system policy level, which tends to be considerably more resistant to being silently reset by future feature updates than the toggle inside settings. As with any registry change, back up the registry first before making any edits. One important caveat deserves to be stated clearly and honestly. On Windows Home Edition specifically, telemetry cannot be reduced to absolute 0 through any official supported method. Microsoft retains some baseline required diagnostic data regardless of how these settings are configured. What disabling diagtrack actually accomplishes is cutting off the optional layer, the richer usage details, crash context information, and session-level reporting that sits on top of that unavoidable required baseline. The required signals still flow through separate underlying channels regardless. For anyone specifically on Windows Home who wants genuinely complete control over what their machine transmits externally, no combination of local settings changes fully delivers that outcome, which is why a growing number of users facing this exact limitation have chosen to move to an entirely different operating system instead. Ultimately, Microsoft was factually correct about the specific claim that went viral last week. The particular service that triggered the panic does not silently transmit user data to Microsoft every 15 minutes the way the original post described. But the broader conversation that post accidentally kicked off was legitimate anyway, because a different service that genuinely does operate on that same 15-minute cycle and genuinely does send data outward has been sitting quietly in the services panel of Windows machines the entire time. And the company that built it has never made a serious, sustained effort to explain that plainly to the people it actually affects. The specific accusation was wrong. The underlying suspicion driving it wasn't unreasonable at all.